Hello and welcome to Sam Not So Wise. My name is Sam. Now there's a popular saying that variety is the spice of life, and that is a kind of mantra that I completely get along with. So I just wanted to talk about authors who write in several genres. Now, I read several genres, mostly sci-fi and fantasy, but also contemporary, a little bit of historical fiction, and I just try and mix it up every now and then. So what could be better than finding a favorite author who can mix it up a little bit? So I just wanted to make a little video highlighting my favorite authors who write in more than one genre. It's just an ode to these wonderful authors and some recommendations for you if you like the sound of that, if you think that you want to find some authors who write in more than just one genre or style. So with much further ado, let's talk about those authors who mix it up. So the first author I want to talk about is somebody who is gaining a little bit of traction on YouTube. He is quite a famous author, but he's been quite popular on YouTube recently, and that is Kazuo Ishiguro. Now, I thought I had read all but one of his books, but when I was looking up his books, doing a bit of research for this video, I realized there's actually two, so much to my shame, and I will try and change that this year and read the two books that I haven't read. But firstly, Ishiguro has written two kind of light sci-fi books. His most famous one would be Never Let Me Go. I can't really tell you why this is sci-fi because it's kind of a spoiler, but it is definitely on the lighter side of sci-fi. Another one is Clara and the Sun, which is a story about AI in the form of what is called artificial friends. So that is very much a sci-fi, and they could also both possibly be classed as dystopian fiction, at least in my opinion. He has also written a fantasy book called The Buried Giant, which is kind of an ethereal, Arthur-inspired, kind of old-school fantasy book. I wasn't the biggest fan of the book, but I know that a lot of people love it. Now, he has also written some historical fiction, for example, Remains of the Day, which is basically about a butler reminiscing on his life, but it's set in an interesting time period, and that comes into the story as well. An emotional, brilliant book. And Artist of the Floating World, which I read last year and was great. It follows an artist after World War II in Japan who had a role to play in the war, and it's all about the after effects of that. He's also written a bunch of contemporary fiction, such as A Pale Few of Hills, which was his first book, The Unconsoled, When We Were Orphans, and Nocturnes, which is a collection of short stories, all having something connected with music and the night. So yes, he's a very varied author, and I don't think a lot of people quite realize just how varied he is. And I would put them all kind of under the bracket of literary fiction, with his signature style of this creepy atmosphere in the background that is slowly being revealed over the book. So if you want somebody who has quite short books and a lot of variety, then check out Kazuo Ishiguro. The next author I'll talk about is someone you might have heard of before. It is Stephen King. Now, this is a man that has been writing for a very long time, and he's put out about 80 books. And at this point, what genre hasn't he written? There aren't many. But obviously people are mostly aware of his horror works. So let's talk about a few of them. We obviously have things like It, the scary story of a clown, but more importantly, the coming of age of a bunch of kids in this small town. We have Salem's Lot, the vampire story, which is again focusing on the small town community. We have the extremely famous The Shining, about a man going crazy in a hotel. Everybody knows this story. And there are many, many more examples. One that I really, really want to get to is Pet Sematary, for example. But as is always said about Stephen King, what he really writes is about the real horrors of people, not the supernatural things. It's about nasty people and how they can be just disgusting. Now, it's very important to mention The Dark Tower when we're talking about Stephen King. I'm holding up The Gunslinger, the first book, and Basically, this has almost everything in it. It has horror, obviously, but it is a fantasy series. It has a lot of sci-fi elements, it has romance, it has westerns, it has his classic coming-of-age stories. This is a book that is a book series that is absolutely jammed full of different genres and the themes that go along with them. Now, he has written some dystopian sci-fi. A big example, is The Stand, his kind of post-apocalyptic and during the apocalyptic book about a virus. We have Under the Dome, where a city gets covered by a literal dome. I've not read this, I plan to this year. The Long Walk, a dystopian story about a competition where people walk until they cannot anymore and then they die if they don't, and the winner gets a grand prize. And we also have The Running Man, the last two written under the pseudonym of Richard Bachman, but that's still Stephen King. We have pure sci-fi. He's written pure sci-fi, for example, the time travel story of 11/22/63. Really need to get onto that one as well, really need to read that. And The Tommyknockers, which is supposed to be a really strange sci-fi story, quite mixed receptions for that one. He's written some kind of contemporary fiction, for example, my favourite being Different Seasons, a collection of novellas including The Shawshank Redemption, for example. Excellent collection, no supernatural stuff in this. We have The Green Mile, which does have a slight supernatural bent to it, but it is really just about the people who work in a prison on death row. Obviously, in the most recent kind of decade or so, he has written a lot of crime fiction. He is on a crime spree in terms of his writing. So basically with Stephen King, the possibilities are endless. You have 80 books to choose from, and you are very likely to get a mix of books if you choose 5 from them. And that is excellent for us. Now, the next one may come as a little bit of a surprise to you, and that is because it is George Orwell. Now, people probably wouldn't expect me to be talking about George Orwell as a man who talks in many genres, but the guy had range, so we'll talk about it now. The obvious one is 1984, my favourite book of all time, a cornerstone of dystopian fiction and a sci-fi classic. We have the next most obvious one, which is Animal Farm, a satirical allegory, and you could even argue that it is a fantasy in some way, you know, talking pigs. We have historical fiction, one of my favourites by him, Burmese Days. It's not necessarily about an event in history, but it is based upon his experiences in Myanmar when he was a policeman there in the British Empire, and it is very faithful to what the world is like, and it looks back into history in that time period and place. General fiction, he obviously has a bunch of general fiction. I don't know what you'd call it. It's not contemporary anymore, modern classic maybe. For example, Keep the Aspidistra Flying, Coming Up for Air, A Clergyman's Daughter, and they are all extremely depressing fiction. Now, he also wrote some non-fiction. So he wrote, for example, The Road to Wigan Pier, which is a book all about the class divides in the UK. He wrote memoirs as well. So within his non-fiction, he has variety. He wrote 2 memoirs, one being Down and Out in London and Paris, which was about his experience as being homeless in these 2 cities, and a Homage to Catalonia, which details his experience of fighting in the Spanish Civil War. He also wrote a bunch of essays. He was a very famous essayist. So he has a truly varied bibliography: sci-fi, dystopia, satire, historical fiction, general fiction, non-fiction, memoirs, essays, and he is just full of witty and biting political and social commentary in all of them, and I highly recommend him. He is one of the best authors ever. Now, the next author I'm talking about is somebody I'm recently getting into more and more, and I'm really enjoying him, is Adrian Tchaikovsky. Now, this man's output is simply ridiculous. To say he is rivaling Brandon Sanderson is just not true, because he is just beating him. He puts out 2 or 3 books a year just endlessly. Now, he is famous for sci-fi writing, such as his most famous series, which is the Children of Time trilogy, all about evolution, terraforming, and space spiders. Very, very good. He has another trilogy called the Final Architecture trilogy, which I've not read, which is about an alien war. He has the series called Bioforms, which is about bioengineered animals. 2 books out so far, a 3rd one coming out later this year. But he is also a prolific fantasy writer. He has written 3 books so far of his Tyrant Philosophers series, which is a planned 5-book series, which is all about imperialism in a fantasy world and is somewhat dystopian in nature. His first ever series that he wrote was called The Shadow of the Apt, which is a 10-book series about people who share abilities with giant insects, and I believe has elements of steampunk as well. So variety within the genres of fantasy and sci-fi as well. He's written a bunch of standalones. For example, sci-fi, we have Cage of Souls, which I've just recently started as of recording this. Another one called Doors of Eden, which I'm also hoping to get to this year. And he has some standalone fantasy books, maybe the most famous being Guns of the Dawn, which is a flintlock fantasy. Now, he's also written so many novellas in both sci-fi and fantasy. So not only does he switch genres, he switches the lengths of his stories. He's got a 10-book series, a 5-book series, bunch of trilogies, standalones, novella series. His imagination is just unbounded and he writes so much, which is difficult to catch up with, but it's good for us because we have a lot of books with a lot of variety. Next up, we have an absolute master of both classic sci-fi and fantasy, and that is the Queen herself, Urusula K Le Guin. So let's start off with the fantasy, maybe her most famous, I'm not sure, what do you think? So that is Earthsea. This is a 6-book series of quite short novels that mostly follow the story of a legendary wizard in this world. I've read the first 4 because I have this collection which I found in an HMV in the UK. But this has absolutely beautiful prose, it's very ethereal and full of thematic work, and these are just absolutely timeless classics for basically all ages. She is also well known for her sci-fi work, which is called The Hainish Cycle, which is a bunch of loosely connected novels within the story of the Ecumen, which is a society based up of around 400-ish planets. Probably the most famous within that series is The Left Hand of Darkness, a story all about an envoy from the Ecumen who basically gets into a bit of trouble trying to get this planet to join the Ecumen. Excellent book. I just reread it and I love it. That's the only one I've read. Probably the next most famous would be The Dispossessed, which I really need to get to, hopefully this year. We'll see. But she was also a prolific non-fiction writer, so she wrote a lot of essays, mostly kind of about writing or genre fiction, but she also wrote a lot of feminist articles and a lot of writings about social issues. But on top of that, she also wrote poetry. So she was a woman of extremely high talent, and she put this talent into many different areas of her writing. A truly inspirational writer. So my final feature author is going to be someone who, if you've watched this channel before, you probably know who I'm going to talk about, and that is my guy, Iain Banks, or Iain M. Banks. My favorite author, I was obviously going to talk about him. So he was a sci-fi writer. He wrote, for example, The Culture, such as this book, Use of Weapons, book 3 in the Culture series. And this is a 10-book space opera series. All of these books are standalones and it's set in a utopian world, at a very high-tech world. But that isn't the only sci-fi he wrote. He also wrote 4 standalone sci-fi novels. For example, The Algebraist, which I will be reading in a buddy read in a very short amount of time, and I'm extremely excited to be reading a sci-fi book that I haven't read by him. Now, some of his books, sci-fi especially, have elements of fantasy. They kind of read like fantasy books, seeing as especially the culture, they deal with kind of older civilizations. So these civilizations are on their way up and they kind of live in feudal systems and they just read like historical fiction or fantasy. A good example is Inversions, which is book 6 in the culture. This has almost zero sci-fi elements to it, but it is set within the culture universe. So even within this sci-fi series, there is a lot of variety. But he was also a contemporary fiction writer. He wrote 14 contemporary fiction novels. So he wrote about 28 books over the course of his career, which is quite impressive. I've read 5 of them. I'm slowly making my way through. And all of them are very different from each other. My favorite would probably be The Crow Roads, which is difficult to describe, but it's basically kind of like a family drama in a way. And it surrounds a mystery about a death in the family. But all of his books that I've read so far, and the 5 contemporary books I've read, are all very different from each other. So the man has variety and the man has imagination, and you can just get lost in all 28 of his works. Now I just want to add a little coda to the video, a few extra honourable mentions, people that I think kind of fit what I'm trying to talk about, or authors that I haven't read too much of. So for example, we have Brandon Sanderson, primarily a fantasy author of series such as the Stormlight Archive, which is very hot right now, but he has also written a sci-fi series, a YA sci-fi series called Skyward, and a bunch of other things as well. He writes a lot, so you could probably count him within this, I would say. Someone else is Margaret Atwood. She is primarily a contemporary fiction writer. For example, stories such as The Blind Assassin, which is a brilliant book. That might be the most famous one that I've read, at least. But she obviously also wrote some dystopian fiction, such as The Handmaid's Tale and its follow-up, The Testaments. Absolute kind of stalwarts of the dystopian fiction genre. But she also wrote a sci-fi trilogy, the Mad Adam trilogy, which begins with Oryx and Crake, which is a post-apocalyptic kind of climate and genetic modification sci-fi series. Very underrated, but a brilliant trilogy. Also, we have Ken Liu. So I've only read The Paper Menagerie, but that in itself is an exercise in variety, because it just contains a whole different mishmash of hard sci-fi, soft sci-fi, fantasy, magical realism, all that kind of stuff. Already within those 450 pages, we get so much variety. But he has also written a fantasy series, The Dandelion Dynasty, which I'll be starting soon, hopefully. And he has just been commissioned to write a new series, which I think the first book comes out in around November, and I believe it to be cyberpunk. So we're going from epic fantasy to cyberpunk. The man clearly has range. So that's it. We've come to the end of the video. If you've made it this far, as usual, I thank you so much. I very much appreciate you. This was a video just about me showing my appreciation to those authors who have variety within their writing, who provide us with that little bit of spice in our reading life. Now it's up to you, dear viewers. Let me know the writers that I should pick up, who have variety in their writing. They write in 2 or 3, 4, 5 genres, whatever. I love to mix it up, and I love it when authors show their talent, being able to write in more than one style and more than one genre. I think it's absolutely fascinating. So please do let me know in the comments. Let me know if you've read any of these authors and what you think of them. And that is probably it for now. So thank you so much for watching again, and I'll see you in another video soon. Goodbye.